International correspondent George Thomas and international news director Gary Lane. Gentlemen, both great to see you. First off, Gary, how does a summit like this advance the cause of international religious freedom, and particularly for the millions who are persecuted, brutalized, or languishing in prison? How does this help them?
Well, John, it brings people from around the world gathered in Washington, D.C. at the Omni Shoreham. I think they have about 850, 900 people there, and they expose what is happening around the world. They receive testimony from people who have been persecuted for their faith, and exposure and shining light is what is needed. But what does it mean for people that are in prison or persecuted? Many have told me that I've interviewed over the years that, look, prayer is the most important thing. When they get Christians, especially, praying for them, they feel those prayers. And then, of course, many other Christians, once they do pray, the Holy Spirit leads them to write letters and send cards to the prisoners. And when the jail receives these cards and these letters, they go, uh-oh, this must be someone important. Someone knows about this. We better not mistreat them. So it could lead to better treatment of the prisoners as well. So a lot can be accomplished through these summits.
A boon to their spirits as well. George, as Gary just said, it shines the light on these issues. The focus a lot in the past few days has been on China, highlighting the plight of Muslim Uyghurs, but also the Communist Party's dismantling of Christian churches. George, is China the worst offender when it comes to religious freedom?
Well, according to Open Doors, John, that label is to North Korea. They have, for the last 20 years, taken the top spot as the world's worst place for Christians. But let me make this point also. I'm concerned that you have the plight of about 3 million Uyghurs in these detention camps, and really the outrage from the Muslim communities has been a deafening silence, and the Chinese are not turning a page at all. My concern is that we could potentially see the re-education of Christians in China, the potential that we could have Chinese Christians being put in these so-called re-education camps. I'm very, very concerned about that.
And George, some of those Uyghurs are Christians, and you've met some of them. So have I.
Yeah.
There aren't a lot of them, but some of them, we're sure, are also in prison right now.
Yeah.
Gary, what other places should we be paying attention to that aren't getting the spotlight like China or North Korea?
Well, of course, India has really gotten bad under the BJP party. We thought, well, the BJP will behave themselves because they're in power and they want to remain in power, but they aren't. And George can tell you more about this because he's been reporting about it as well. But I think this year alone there have been over 140, 150 cases where churches have been interrupted, their services, pastors beaten, evangelists beaten. And some have even been killed, and that is happening in India. But I'd also say some of the smaller countries that you don't hear about, Eritrea, Somalia, of course, number 3 on Open Doors' list because of al-Shabaab and other radical Muslims there. But there are many. We don't have enough time to go over all of them, but I'd say some of the smaller countries. Wouldn't you, George?
Yeah, John, I was just going to say that also, keep in mind a lot of focus, and for us has been the focus and the plight of Christians around the world. But let's not forget, Muslims are also, by and large, bearing the brunt of the persecution from fellow co-religionists. And I think of, for example, in Afghanistan today, with the U.S. troops pulling out and the Taliban basically sweeping across the country 20 years after we went in to rout al-Qaeda and their proxies like the Taliban out. Today, women and people of faith, minority faiths, are very, very concerned about what's going to happen to them. So, in these kinds of situations, these kinds of summits, it's important to highlight other faith groups, the Baha'i, the Buddhists. I think of, other faith groups that are continuing to suffer for their faith, and maybe not as much as Christians, but I'm glad that we have been, at least the U.S. government as well as other NGOs have put the spotlight on the Uyghurs of China. Very, very important.
An important point that you raised there, George. Real quickly here also, any indication of whether the Biden administration will make this a priority like the Trump administration did? What signs are we seeing right now?
Well, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has just announced that the president will be appointing an ambassador for religious freedom within the next couple of weeks. But it's like, what has taken so long? We're 6 months into the Biden presidency, and in April he appointed an ambassador to Lesotho, another one to Senegal, but no religious freedom ambassador. We've been waiting for 6 months. Now, I think a lot of people that work this issue in Washington are saying, hey, this is great, we're going to have one. But I don't, look, I've been working this issue for many years, and as you know, I worked full-time for the Voice of the Martyrs for about 3 years, and I have never seen this kind of lackadaisical response. I mean, it was tremendous that the Trump administration, what they did. Of course, the first summit was the brainchild of Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, and also Sam Brownback. And they urged President Trump to do that. But I don't think we're going to see the emphasis on religious freedom like we did before.
Finally, George, real quickly here in our last few moments, what do you think it'll take to see real change and make real progress when it comes to religious freedom throughout the world?
Well, I think where it really comes down to, are you going to levy crippling sanctions just like we do, whether it's against Iran or other countries that carry out various kinds of economic disparities and so forth. But when it comes to religious freedom, if we're able to go to these countries, be it an Iran, a Saudi Arabia, North Korea, a China especially, and put crippling sanctions on them. You know, there was a lot of outcry against the Uyghurs of Xinjiang province and calls for the boycotting of the Olympics. Well, guess what? You have a high delegation on their way to China to represent the United States. I mean, if you really want to make a dent on the issue of religious freedom, you've got to throw some crippling sanctions, economic sanctions against these countries.
John, it's basically money talks, and when you start squeezing money from an economy, then they may listen. But I don't see it being a priority. I mean, when has it really been a priority where we've stepped in? The 1998 International Religious Freedom Act allows and calls for sanctions. That's the extreme, sanctions. Everything from maybe just vocal, saying something about a country, condemning them, but sanctions as well, and we have yet to see that happen for religious freedom violations.
Well, and that is why it is important for us to have conversations like these. Gary, George, thank you so much for your time and helping to shed light on this important topic.
You're welcome.